Welcome. My name is Doug Carlson, and I am CEO of the National Utility Contractors Association, known as NUCA. And it is my pleasure to welcome you to our 2020 Virtual Washington Summit. NUCA is the leading trade association working solely for the utility construction and excavation industry in the United States. Founded in 1964, NUCA has a nationwide network of state and regional chapters, contractors, manufacturers, and service providers who install, repair, and maintain all sectors of utility construction, including water, wastewater, broadband, and other utilities. NUCA members are also involved with surface transportation projects where, in addition to road building, our members perform site work and utility relocation services. We dig America. Today's discussion topic focuses on our nation's critical infrastructure systems. Joining our panel today is Mr. Tom Butler with Burgess Civil, Mr. Dan Buckley with Garney Construction, Mr. Jeff Roomer with Petticoat Schmidt, Mr. Evan Wyman with Wyman Associates, and Mr. Zach Perconte with Wyman Associates, who will be our moderator. And I'll turn it over to Zach.
Thanks, Doug. So let's get started here. Infrastructure investment is critical to America's economic recovery as the nation continues to face the COVID-19 pandemic. America's underground water and wastewater infrastructure ensures that Americans have access to clean drinking water, provides businesses with the resources they need to keep our economy moving, and protects our nation's waterways, beaches, and a range of recreational opportunities. What do you see as the current state of our infrastructure?
Absolutely. If I remember correctly, I think our infrastructure is repaired at a rate of like 2% a year or something like that, repaired/replaced at a rate of 2% a year, which means an improvement has to last roughly 50 years until it's going to be repaired/replaced again. And that's if it doesn't break in those 50 years, which is highly likely.
Yeah, so our infrastructure is facing significant needs as well. Innovative ideas are needed. Transportation sector is ever changing. And we need to embrace this, and we need to move forward with moving more P3 design build work in both the above surface infrastructure, which is already happening, and below surface infrastructure with our water and sewer infrastructure. Get that more under the realm of what we're doing above the ground with P3s and design build, and bring more design build and P3s to our water industry.
And Zach, I'd just add that specifically from EPA estimates for water and wastewater, on the wastewater side, they're talking about 271 billion needed right now. On drinking water, 472 billion. I think the mayors and the governors would argue it's a heck of a lot higher than that. The problem is, to Dan's point, a lot of this is out of sight, out of mind infrastructure. Surface transportation seems to get, and other infrastructure seems to get a lot more attention to what's underground, and it's unfortunate. And we're in a situation where the government can now decide to pay some now or pay a heck of a lot later. So yeah, we're in a hole right now.
Yeah, and Evan, you bring up a good point that surface transportation does get a lot of recognition with the issues that are associated with it. But what we want to stress and what we need to have happen is that anytime there's any sort of surface improvement, for there to be investigation into any underground utilities that could also be improved at the same time, so that we are only affecting an area as little as need be to accomplish all improvements.
Yeah, I think you're right, Tom. And I've heard critics state previously that, well, when we do surface transportation infrastructure improvements, we certainly consider some of the subsurface utilities and subsurface infrastructure that exist as a part of those improvements. But that's a secondary look to a primary responsibility of transportation upgrading and infrastructure investment. There's a lot of aging infrastructure that we find on a daily basis that is aging and is in serious need of replacement, and not only from a resiliency and continued performance standpoint, but also from a health issue as well, that I think is unfortunately overlooked in that process as we continue to focus on surface improvements and less focus on the out of sight, out of mind infrastructure that exists within the country today.
Yeah, it's funny, Jeff, that you mentioned that, because when we go around and talk to some of our legislators, they'll specifically say, well, Dan, if you could have one idea of what you could do to bring this to people's attention a little bit more directly, what would you do? I said, well, in a great world, I'd take all the sewer lines and raise them about 15 feet in the air and have all the leaks just drop on top of them as they're walking on the sidewalk. And what they don't realize is that sewer, that waste is going right into our groundwater and into our environment. That needs to stop.
Yeah, absolutely. Beyond that, I think, the question of resiliency has come up recently. I know we've worked with HUD recently on a resiliency committee. Dan, I think you're involved personally on that. But one of the issues around resiliency and a big push, in my state, particularly in Florida, we're susceptible to a lot of storm damage, and we still have a lot of overhead to your point exactly, a lot of overhead power lines. And there's a drive in the country to get more and more of that underground, and that is a focus because it is susceptible to storm damage in our state. But the stuff that's already been moved underground or always existed underground is oftentimes being ignored as a result. So,
yeah, I mean, a perfect example of what you said is in DC, our local power company just spent around $721 million to just put a small sector of the power lines underground. But it's because of all the wind that we get in the mid-Atlantic area, crosswinds that come across from the plains, that create a whole bunch of damage in a lot of our tree-lined areas. So they're taking the power lines underground because people are out of power. So that affects them. It's very much like the roadway. It gets affected, so it gets fixed. For us, we are already out of sight. So it's hard for us to convince people we have an issue. We have a serious issue. Where is the next Flint, Michigan going to be? People don't realize this, but right in our nation's capital in 2002, we had Flint, Michigan happen in DC. It was kept very quiet. Nobody talked about it, but we did over $100 million worth of lead surface line repairs. And there are Flint, Michigans everywhere. And Flint, Michigan, I think, is just scratching the surface. I think who here on our panel knows the numbers on how much money we lose in waterline waste on a daily basis?
Gosh.
I don't know that anybody can quantify that total cost.
But I think it's in like 130 million bathtubs a day of leaked water into out of the system. It's because our pipes have reached their useful age limit. It's done. These were put back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, and the useful life of our infrastructure below ground is well below where it should be.
Dan, I've personally replaced water main trunk mains within the last 5 years. As a matter of fact, I worked on a project out west that was still transmitting 42-inch diameter water main that was transmitted through a wood stave water line that was put in the late 1800s. And the district that was responsible for the water line had said on multiple occasions, we just don't have the money to replace the water line. We just don't have the money to replace it. And we actually helped perform a little bit of study for them, and were able to demonstrate that the water that they were spending alone on treatment of the water that was leaking out of the line was more than the cost that it would take to actually replace the water main. And a light bulb went off with somebody, and somehow they found the funding to be able to replace the water main, and immediately realized the ROI by reduction in the amount of water that they had to treat. Over a couple of year process, they completely paid for that new water main. And that again, that doesn't even begin to address the health considerations of groundwater and drinking water that are interacting on a regular basis. And this is post-treatment. So that water is being delivered then to homes and to businesses out there, and our kids are drinking it, our grandkids are drinking it, and it's a huge impact that, again, goes sight unseen. As you mentioned earlier, a big project in DC trying to get power lines underground, the cost involved with that alone, as well as the transportation infrastructure replacement that you can see, based on the funding levels that we have of leveled funding or decreased funding, barely covers the cost of that. How would we ever imagine that we're ever going to address the issue of water mains installed in the late 1800s or the early 1900s or lead service lines that exist out there that we don't even begin to have the funding to be able to approach.
And Jeff, it is amazing how good we are at reacting to a disaster, but being proactive about ensuring we have effective and sound infrastructure. We're just not so good at making sure we have that before something really goes south.
And
the key word there was reactive, correct?
Yeah.
We all saw what happened in Flint, Michigan, and I think within 6 or 8 months after Flint occurring, I was in Washington, D.C. talking to legislators, and I told people I'm here to talk about Flint, Colorado, or Flint, Florida, and I had some legislators that looked at me a little bit sideways and thought, well, what? And I explained to one particular congressman out of Colorado that his grandkids, I knew him personally, and his grandkids lived in an area where we'd recently done work, and I told him, Congressman, your grandkids, I know where they live, and we just did a lead water line replacement program in the neighborhood that your grandkids lived in, and he was flabbergasted. From his perspective and from a lawmaker's perspective, they were talking about an issue that was 2,500 miles away from Denver, Colorado, in Flint, Michigan, and once he realized that same condition occurred not only in the state and the locality that he represented, but also in his grandkids' neighborhood, that made a different impact with him. And I think we're just hoping to continue to educate people to that extent, specifically their lawmakers.
well, and to that point, Jeff, I think it's important that we make everybody know that lead pipe wasn't outlawed until 1986, I think. So this isn't something where, oh, they stopped using that in the 20s. We don't need to worry about it anymore. It was a very recent time when lead pipe was actually outlawed. So it's been installed in my lifetime. So it's that's a big deal.
And you're a young man, Tom.
Oh yeah, very young. I'm prematurely gray.
Highway funding is currently set to expire on September 30th. What's the latest with highway legislation?
Well, I can tell you this, Zach, there's a lot out there, just like everything else. There's Senate legislation, the America's Transportation Infrastructure Act. It's $287 billion. The Moving Forward Act, the one I talked about before, that has the House Democrats bill in there. That's $476 billion. Very recently, the Transportation Construction Coalition that we're involved in, no one thinks that this is going to happen over the next couple of months before one of the most important elections in history. So what TCC is looking for is a 1-year extension of current law with marginal increases in funding, emergency funding in the face of this pandemic of $37 billion for state DOTs and $32 billion for public transit agencies. And really the point of the TCCA memo has been, in the end, you have to deal with long-term funding of transportation infrastructure. We've worked on trying to get a hike in the gas tax for a long time. It's probably not going to happen, but Congress has to address the long-term issues to deal with the solvency of the HTF, the Highway Trust Fund. Yeah,
and to your, one of the things you just mentioned, Evan, they're talking about emergency federal funding, and those two combined, $69 billion. That's fantastic. But $69 billion that is used in a planned project will go much further than $69 billion that's used for emergency repairs. Emergencies are always far, far more costly than planned work. So it would behoove us to make sure, and not that I'm against any of this legislation, but that in the future we're looking proactively towards spending our money, not reactively.
Absolutely.
Yeah, sure thing. So we've already talked about some of the work that you all do with water treatment, water mains, sewer rehab, work that gets done on surface transportation, and a little bit on utility relocation. Can you describe some of the programs that we're supporting for water and wastewater infrastructure improvements?
I'll take a first stab at this. And there's a few. The EPA, we mentioned the state revolving fund programs, both clean water and drinking water. There's also the Water Infrastructure Financing and Innovation Act, WIFIA, That's a program that provides grants and loans and allows private capital to fund some of the larger projects, which allows the SRF to fund other projects in that area. Again, the SRF is a good model. The revolving nature of those loans is good. It's just been woefully underfunded since it was established. So NUCA has been at the forefront of water and wastewater infrastructure since it was established, really back in the 60s. But in about, I think, 2008, we said, look, we're never going to get SRF funding that we need. So let's think about innovative financing. And we're looking at private activity bonds. And PABs are a really great way to fund infrastructure without relying on public funding. PABs are tax exempt that encourage state and munis to partner with a private partner and inject unlimited capital into the water and wastewater market. It promotes public-private partnerships. And the beautiful thing about PABs is it transfers the cost, the risk, and the long-term debt from the municipality to the private partner. And yet the municipality still owns the project. And I think there's a 0.001 default rate for PAB projects, for water infrastructure projects. The problem is PABs generally go to more politically attractive projects like housing or student loans. And I think less than 5% traditionally, but I think 1% and 3% have actually gone to water and wastewater because of the state volume cap, which is based on population, which only allows a certain amount of money to go towards different infrastructure. If you get rid of that volume cap, any private source of private capital can partner with the municipality, form a PPP, public-private partnership, and start a project without really needing federal involvement. The problem with that is some more on the Democratic side have been reluctant because of the word private, but PABs really are an effective way to finance these. So we've really been focusing on that over the past several years. At no cost to government, let me just add, you're not talking about any SRF money, marginal cost because of the exempt status of those loans. Again, if you get rid of that state volume cap, anyone and everybody can invest in these projects.
Yeah, I'm a big advocate of private activity bonds, and it's nothing new. I mean, it's being used in our surface transportation every day. They just don't have caps on their bonds. So if we can get rid of those caps for water and wastewater, I think you'd see a lot more improvements going on, not just not in the cities, but in the rural areas that we have that really need the infrastructure improvements that never get looked at. There are a lot of our own neighborhoods that are, whether you want to call them, out in the boonies or in the woods or wherever, that really need the increased money. And if it's not in their budget, there's got to be a way for them to get drinking water to the homes that are a little bit further out than those in the city.
Well, it's just not rural stuff, Dan. St. Petersburg, Florida, fortunately hasn't been in the news lately with spilling sewage into the bay, but it's not that long ago that it happened, and it finally got so bad that there was some pressure put upon them from higher ups to get it fixed, and they're in the process of fixing it, but it's not fixed yet, and unfortunately, part of what they believed to be a solution wasn't to fix a leaking system, but to build more treatment plants. So it's a very short-sighted way of fixing the problem, because with moderate leaking in those systems, like a moderately leaking manhole and downstream pipe, if you seal those up over the entire system, it costs and the savings would be paid for in 1 year by the diminished infiltration into that system, so that the water treatment plant is actually treating only sanitary sewer and not leaking groundwater. So yeah, instead of building a whole new treatment plant, let's just fix what we have.
Hey, look, Tom, we've talked about it on the clean water side, where you're now discussing it on the wastewater side. I've been involved with legislative discussions primarily through NUCA for probably close to the last 15 years. I'm hard pressed to go back far enough to find a year that we have not been in DC discussing private activity bonds. The model exists, it's there, it's been proven to be successful time after time after time again, where we need investment infusion into different areas in our country. If I recall, I believe back in the 70s, we lifted the volume caps for solid waste disposal facilities. That had huge results and huge success in development of new solid waste disposal facilities. I've sat in, and I don't care what your political affiliation is or what side of the aisle that you're on, every lawmaker that I've sat with and talked to about this and explained this to has said, absolutely, this makes sense. Whether it was offset and pay-go requirements, whether it was the need to present opportunities for Wall Street and for private investment to continue to invest. It's some of the most liberal or most conservative lawmakers that I've met with and dealt with all agree, most of which we've got in previous Congresses to sign on and co-sponsor legislation that existed. I've seen PAB volume cap restriction lifting legislation introduced in almost every Congress since I've been there. The problem that we've seen is that it's been stripped out of those omnibus bills as a result of negotiation. Why this would get stripped is beyond my understanding, because it does have so much bipartisan support. Everybody understands it, understands the mechanism, understands why it makes good sense for infrastructure investment. We've been talking about infrastructure investment and the need for it, not only here today, but across our country for most of my lifetime, and we still seem to come up against roadblocks. Yet here we have a mechanism that solves that problem and delivers good equity into infrastructure investment with no cost to the taxpayer or to legislatively to our funding overall. And yet we can't seem to get this across the finish line. It just baffles me.
Agreed.
Well, thank you, Jeff, and we'll continue to educate and to push that initiative in Washington, D.C. I want to focus our attention also on the other legislation that NUCA is backing. Can you talk a little bit, and maybe Evan, you can give us a little bit of a brief on what is this year's priorities for our NUCA Summit that our members are focusing on?
For water sewer, for transportation?
For water, wastewater infrastructure.
Okay. Well, and I would just say that there's a lot of stuff out there right now, and most of it is in response to the coronavirus pandemic. So right now on the water side, well, first, the Water Quality Protection and Job Creation Act is really NUCA's #1 priority. This was a Big Four bill out of the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee, $14 billion reauthorized for the Clean Water SRF. There are some set-asides and some stipulations that we're not crazy about, but $14 billion would be a very big deal for clean water infrastructure. We're hoping that gets wrapped up in something. It's not going to happen this year, obviously, but we've set the stage, we think, for a little bit. There's the Drinking Water Infrastructure Act and America's Water Infrastructure Act, which together make up the WRDA bill, which is the Water Resources Development Act, a very big water infrastructure package. The good news is it does pay attention to water and wastewater general infrastructure. There are marginal increases for the Clean Water SRF and the Drinking Water SRF, but not enough that we should throw our full support behind. One of the bills that is in play in response to the pandemic is the Moving It Forward Act, HR 2. We sent a letter in support of many of the provisions in HR 2. There's lots of money for infrastructure. There's $40 billion for the Clean Water SRF. No one really thinks or has high hopes that that's going to pass. But what's important about HR 2 is that it does include lifting the cap on private activity bonds. And the way it's worded is it would add water and sewer facilities to the list of categories that are not subject to the volume cap on private activity bonds. That's exactly what we want. That's exactly what we're pushing for. I don't think anyone thinks HR 2 is going to happen, but I am encouraged by the fact that this was put together HR 2 is a Democratic bill. The Democrats have traditionally, they're the ones who have a little bit of opposition to PABs, if there's any. So I thought it was very encouraging that HR 2 has that provision in it. So we encourage all staffers, all lawmakers to take a look at that provision, and moving forward, end of this year into next, to Jeff's point and to Dan and Tom's point, PABs is really the way to go. We should never neglect the state revolving fund, but we're going to need some outside funding, and we have a very interested private sector that wants to invest in this infrastructure. So that's pretty much where we are, Doug, at this point.
Okay.
Yeah, let's switch gears. Speaking of our roadways, and talk a little bit about surface transportation. Can you all elaborate on what kind of work you do on transportation projects and why NUCA is so invested in transportation legislation?
Well, I can tell you from our standpoint, within Petticoat Schmidt, in the Northeast Florida area, we do an extensive amount of work with the Department of Transportation, with local municipalities, City of Jacksonville, surrounding counties in Northeast Florida, for roadway improvements, widening projects, new roadways, and rehab of existing roadways. So we probably close to a third of our annual revenue is revenue that's generated from specifically transportation infrastructure projects overall.
Yeah, and I think a large number of the NUCA contractors out there do participate in a lot of the roadway and surface transportation work. As far as Garney construction is concerned, we deal with water only. We're not a roadway transportation or heavy civil highway contractor. But I will say this, we rely on the surface transportation funding because water is a precursor to the roads that are being put in. You don't put a new roadway in without relocating your utilities and upgrading the utilities. So every time new transportation work is put in, we get a piece of that work, and it's integral for our revenue and for our employees to be able to be a part of that and be a subcontractor to a Petticoat Schmidt, to be able to provide work for our employees. So it's imperative.
Well, and Dan, you just stressed that's why we're involved with transportation, whether it's the number one thing our companies do or it's ancillary to the work that we do primarily. Fortunately, there is some coordination on transportation projects with infrastructure projects, and I mean subsurface infrastructure. There's not enough coordination, but I mean that's why we do it, because it does go hand in hand with the work that is our primary focus.
Well, I want to thank our panel today for their input and insight and their passion for what we do. As we, NUCA's model is we advocate for the rebuilding of our nation's infrastructure, and we fight for clean water. And so thank you, gentlemen, for your time today, and we'll keep fighting for this issue. Have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hey, guys.